Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauer, zu einer weiteren Folge im Auge des Bruders mit Scott Ritter hier auf unserem YouTube-Kanal Gegenpol. Mein Name ist Monique Stegemann und in dieser Woche geht es um folgende Themen. Baerbock sieht eine Führungsrolle Deutschlands in der Welt. Entspricht das der Realität? Wie verändert der NATO-Beitritt Schwedens die russische Strategie in der Ostsee? Und welchen Nutzen hat die von den USA gelieferte Streumunition für die Ukraine? Hallo Scott, schön dich zu sehen.
Hello, how are you?
Mir geht es sehr gut. Wie geht es dir?
I'm doing good, thanks.
Toll. Scott, die deutsche Außenministerin Annalena Baerbock, die hat in einem Gastbeitrag im Nachrichtenmagazin The Guardian betont, wie stark der Ukraine-Krieg die Wahrnehmung der Rolle Deutschlands in der Welt beeinflusst hat. Aus ihrer Sicht kommt Deutschland eine weltweite Führungsrolle zu, um Frieden, Freiheit und internationale Ordnung zu verteidigen. Was sagst du als US-Bürger zu der angeblichen Führungsrolle Deutschlands in der Welt? Wie bewerten das die USA, Scott, und wie bewertet das der Rest der Welt?
First and foremost, Germany is a sovereign nation and as such has every right to define its role in the world as it best sees fit. And if the foreign minister of Germany seeks to claim a global leadership role in the field of peace and security, that's her right. It's my right to disagree. Not with Germany's right to do this. I think any nation that wants to take a leadership role internationally to reduce the risks of war and to promote peace and mutual prosperity should be applauded. And if that's what Germany was doing, I would applaud it. That's not what Germany's doing. First and foremost, if you're going to call yourself a global leader, you need to have global leading capabilities. Germany is a nation with absolutely no meaningful military. So to speak of promoting peace without the ability to project power is meaningless unless you've founded your position on a principled stance of the highest moral standards. Germany, of course, has not done that. In Ukraine, it supports the regime of Zelensky, which has wrapped itself in the shroud of Banderist ideology linked to Stepan Bandera, a man who fought side by side with the Nazis of Adolf Hitler, slaughtering tens of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Poles and Russians. This is the German foreign policy. It's not a leading policy. It's a failing policy. They don't have a military worthy of the name. Germany also is an economy in decline. If you're going to be a global leader, you need to be able to go out there and say, we are the example. But Germany is in the process of deindustrializing. It's losing important jobs. It's losing production capacity. So I think maybe the foreign minister of Germany needs to stop writing guest op-eds and maybe sit down and go on a retreat, a vacation, and contemplate the reality of the situation that Germany finds itself in. I'm not saying that Germany shouldn't seek to be a world leader. In fact, I think in this day and age, any nation that is genuinely seeking peace, peaceful coexistence, multilateral economic prosperity should be applauded. And I would love at some point in time to be able to applaud Germany. But it's not going to be with this current foreign minister articulating the stance that she has.
Baerbock behauptet, dass man alles versucht hat, um gemeinsam mit Russland eine europäische Sicherheitsstruktur zu schaffen. Die Eskalation des Ukraine-Krieges habe aber gezeigt, dass Putins Russland eine Gefahr für Europa bleibt und man sich deshalb gegen Russland organisieren muss, nicht mit Russland. Haben die NATO und die EU tatsächlich versucht, zusammen mit Moskau eine europäische Sicherheitsstruktur zu schaffen? Und Scott, wie ordnest du Baerbocks Aussage ein, dass man sich jetzt gegen Russland organisieren müsse? Was bedeutet das konkret?
Well, I mean, NATO will claim that it did make an effort to work with Russia. They did form a NATO-Russian council, but NATO never took it seriously. It was designed to create a forum that made Russia feel as if it was part of a process that, in fact, it wasn't part of. Because at the same time that NATO created this council, Germany was supporting the expansion of NATO up to Russia's borders. That's not constructive cooperation with Russia. That's lying, deceiving Russia. I would ask Baerbock to reflect on the words of former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who acknowledges that Germany's role in pursuing the Minsk Accords was deceptive, that Germany was part of a concerted effort to deceive Russia into believing that Ukraine was serious about implementing the Minsk Accords, all the while Ukraine was rebuilding an army trained by NATO. That's Germany, by the way. I just want to point that out to Ms. Baerbock in case she forgot that. Trained a Ukrainian army capable of offensive military operations in the Donbass. She's lying through her teeth. Either that or she is as ignorant as the day is long. Or it could be both. She could be ignorant and lying. But what she's not doing is telling the truth. She's misrepresenting the facts, and she's denying the reality that Germany has been part of a concerted NATO effort designed to weaken Russia by seeking to strip Ukraine away from the Russian sphere of influence and interest, to push a pro-NATO, and indeed, if Germany got its way, a NATO presence up to within a few hundred kilometers of the Russian capital. People don't think about that. That if Ukraine actually joined NATO, that would mean that NATO would have a military trained by NATO, 260, 300, 400,000 strong, within 200 kilometers, 200 so kilometers of the Russian capital. This is a game changer in terms of how Russia needs to view its defenses. And it's unacceptable. In addition to having the physical presence of troops, NATO will be able to project a long-range strike capability, again, that would threaten the Russian capital. Germany doesn't think about these things, apparently. Or maybe Germany does think about these things, and this is exactly what Germany wants, to weaken Russia, to create the conditions where Russia will have to capitulate because the prospects of fighting a conventional war against a NATO threat that is that close to the Russian capital becomes untenable. This is the German dream, the NATO dream. Russia's not playing that game. So I think Baerbock is completely misstating the reality there. The fact of the matter is Germany is currently participating in a NATO-driven strategy of achieving the strategic defeat of Russia in Ukraine. It's failing, by the way. I just want to point that out to the German audience in case you're not getting the truth from your media. But the Ukrainian army is being eviscerated on a daily basis. They are making no progress, no meaningful, discernible progress against the Russian defenses. And Russia is growing stronger by the day. And this, I think, was reflected in the recent NATO summit, where NATO, including Germany, was unable to come up with a viable, discernible strategy for dealing with Russia. What they've agreed to do is continue doing what they have done, which means they are continuing to double down on failure.
Auf dem NATO-Gipfel in Vilnius hat der Gastgeber Litauen gefordert, die NATO solle permanente Stützpunkte entlang der russischen Grenze einrichten. Denkst du, die NATO wird das in naher Zukunft umsetzen? Wie wird Russland darauf reagieren?
NATO is an alliance composed of 31 sovereign states, 32 now if Sweden is brought in. And I think Russia has always said that, sovereign states get to act in a sovereign fashion, but that there are consequences for these actions. NATO speaks of putting permanent bases. Now, what is a permanent base? What does that constitute? Are they talking about making permanent the battle groups that are currently deployed into the Baltic states and Poland? These are battalion-sized elements that are going to be reinforced to brigade-sized elements. And then, if that's the case, let's just reflect on what they're saying. A brigade is around 4,000 to 5,000 men. Ukraine just built 9 to 12 brigades, a force of 60+ thousand troops to carry out operations against Russia, and these brigades are being destroyed as we speak. That's the future. That's what these NATO brigades have to look forward to. A single brigade, NATO brigade on the soil of Latvia is as meaningful as a drop of water in the ocean. It has no no real value. This is about NATO impressing NATO. But there will be consequences. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Newton's third law applies to geopolitics as well. And should NATO seek to expend resources to build these permanent bases, Russia will respond. Russia will respond in a way that overmatches NATO's capability, meaning that NATO will be confronted with the reality that it will never win. It will never prevail. It cannot prevail. Russia will not allow it to prevail. Russia is not seeking to dominate NATO, but Russia is seeking to defend itself from NATO, and the best defense is creating a reality where the enemy is faced with the inevitability of defeat, and this is the reality for NATO. They will never be able to match the Russians in terms of conventional military power. That doesn't mean that NATO doesn't have the ability to produce weapons and deploy troops, but the financial reality of trying to expand NATO to the scope and scale necessary to overmatch Russia is beyond the ability of the constituent states at this point in time. Many of these states are undergoing economic turmoil. Germany, in particular, is facing certain realities. I'm anxious to see how the German defense minister will square the demands for increased military spending with the harsh economic fiscal realities that Germany is facing. It'll be interesting. France, similarly, can they afford to build up their military? Can any NATO country? Great Britain, a nation that has shown a proclivity to talk tough, is dealing with a shrinking military, not an expanding military. It's become so small that people question, the viability of England, Great Britain, the United Kingdom maintaining the current level of participation in the NATO command structure. Why would you allow the British to be so strongly represented in the senior levels when their military is so pathetically small? This is the reality. So NATO has a lot of vision out there, but the one thing that NATO, hasn't reflected on responsibly is the reality that in the real war that's being fought in Ukraine today, the real war, a war that NATO could not imagine the scope and scale of the violence taking place. In that real war, Russia is defeated a NATO proxy.
Bleiben wir beim Thema NATO, Scott. Was bedeutet die Aufnahme Schwedens und Finnlands in die NATO für die russischen Verteidigungspläne der Exklave Kaliningrad? Eine Blockade der Ostsee durch NATO-Kräfte ist nun leichter möglich. Wie denkst du darüber? Und welche Rolle spielen die kombinierten Luftwaffen der skandinavischen Länder?
All Sweden has done is guarantee that if there is a general war between NATO and Russia, that Sweden will be struck by the full capabilities of the Russian armed forces. I sort of laugh when I see people talking about how the Baltic has become a NATO sea, when people don't realize that within 1 to 2 weeks, Russia can occupy and destroy all 3 Baltic states. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia have zero survivability in a general war against Russia. They would be eliminated, and suddenly the Baltic is no longer a NATO lake, is it? The Russian coastline is expanded. And what happens when Russia sends the new 70,000 strong corps through Finland and sweeps aside the Finnish forces occupying the southern coastline of Finland? Suddenly, the Baltic is looking like a Russian lake, doesn't it? And then Sweden will find out that its naval facilities, which are impressive during peacetime, aren't so impressive when subjected to the full destructive power of Russian long-range precision strike munitions. The role of NATO's Air Force will be simply to take off and be shot down, to land at airfields that no longer exist. This is the reality of war. Again, NATO has not imagined the scope and scale of the violence that would come to bear in a general war against Russia. There's a lot of people right now playing silly games on PowerPoint, looking at maps and stuff, but they're disrespecting the reality of war. The reality of war that right now in Ukraine has over 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers dead. The entire Ukrainian Air Force swept from the skies and destroyed. This is the reality. The Ukrainian economy devastated. All, Ukraine's tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces being destroyed every day. This is the reality. Finland and Sweden ready to accept this reality because that's their new reality. They joined an organization that is no longer a defensive organization. It's an organization that has assumed an offensive posture, one that is openly articulated as seeking the strategic defeat of Russia. When Russia says that it cannot imagine living in a world without a Russia, people should understand what strategic defeat of Russia means. It means the death of the entire world. Is this really the organization that Sweden and Finland sought to join? I think that you're going to find in a matter of years, both nations will deeply regret their decision to join NATO.
Lass uns auf ein anderes Thema schauen, Scott. US-Präsident Joe Biden hat bestätigt, dass die USA Streumunition an die Ukraine liefern werden. Dabei ließ er den Satz fallen, dass der Ukraine bald die Artilleriemunition ausgehen werden. Und auch die Bestände der USA seien fast leer. Welchen militärischen Nutzen kann die Streumunition für die Ukraine haben?
Well, first of all, we need to reflect on the fact that this is not a situation that just sprung up on us. Jan Stoltenberg back in the fall straight up said that Ukraine will run out of ammunition sometime this summer. Well, gosh, I looked at the calendar. It's summer. It's time for Ukraine to run out of ammunition. And that's exactly what's happening. The United States and Europe both, again, this is something people need to reflect on when they listen to the bold statements coming out of NATO. Words are impressive until they're not. Words have to be backed by reality. And it's one thing to say that we will support Ukraine. It's another thing to actually do it. Neither Europe nor the United States have been able to solve Ukraine's ammunition problem. Ukraine is running out of ammunition. And we don't have any left to give except these cluster munitions, these 155 millimeter artillery shells. And the sole purpose of giving them to Ukraine was political in nature, to be seen as continuing to provide Ukraine with artillery shells until which time we can produce the ones that they really need. Understand what I just said. They don't need these. They can't use these. These are not good weapons. It's a political gesture to give them shells until we can produce the ones they really need, which means that these shells are not going to have a meaningful military impact, and nobody expects them to have a meaningful military impact. This allows Ukraine to have the perception of staying in the fight. That's what they say. We're going to keep Ukraine in the fight. Russia has been reticent about using cluster munitions. There's evidence that cluster munitions have been used by Russia in Ukraine, but not in overwhelming numbers. And recently, it appears that Russia has stopped using cluster munitions. I think because they score better political points when Ukraine uses weapons against civilian targets. They take away an argument that says, "Yeah, but Russia's using cluster munitions." But understand this: Russia has cluster munitions. They have a whole bunch of cluster munitions. And if Ukraine wants to play the cluster munition game and start employing these weapons against Russians, I think it's only fair to expect that Russia will retaliate in kind. The difference is that the Russian retaliation will be overwhelming and devastating, not only for the Ukrainian military, but frankly speaking, for the Ukrainian population or the Russian population, because much of this fighting is taking place on the soil of Russia, which might be one reason why Russia has hesitated to use cluster munitions, because it doesn't want to create an unexploded ordnance nightmare on Russian soil for the future of the Russian people. But Russia will not allow Ukraine to achieve any military advantage. And if the use of cluster munitions becomes a problem for the Russians, I don't foresee it becoming a problem. Given the fact that cluster munitions are designed to be used against massed armor formations and troops in the open. And that's not the war that's being waged in Ukraine right now. But if it does become a problem, I can't speak on behalf of Russia, and I would never want to be seen as speaking on behalf of Russia, but just based upon some words that have come out of Russian figures of authority, I think Russia would take the gloves off and Ukraine would pay an extraordinarily high price. The bottom line is there's nothing that can be done in terms of providing either cluster munitions, additional, cruise missiles. France now is talking about providing the Scalp, which is the French version of the Storm Shadow, the missile that the Ukrainians have received from the British. There's talk about the United States providing ATACMS or F-16s. No weapon system by itself or together with others is going to change the outcome of this conflict, which is a strategic Russian victory over Ukraine and by extension NATO.
Auffällig hierbei, Scott, ist die westliche Reaktion auf die Ankündigung der USA. Die gleichen Politiker, die den Einsatz von Streumunition ansonsten ächten, begrüßen nun die Lieferung an die Ukraine. Wie passt das zusammen? Was ist aus der Ächtung von Streumunition in der Konvention von Oslo geworden?
Well, first of all, let's be clear that the conventions outlawing cluster munitions that don't outlaw cluster munitions. It's a treaty that has no enforceability. It's voluntary in nature, and neither the United States, Russia, nor Ukraine have signed it. So I think people need to stop talking about the illegality of these weapons. There's nothing illegal about the use of. We can speak of the immorality of these weapons. I think that's a fair thing to say. And the United States has recognized that the use of these weapons presents a moral problem. That's why in 2016 we stopped using these weapons and we pulled them into the war reserve. Now, we have not agreed to ban these weapons altogether because we have certain scenarios where we feel that the dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, the cluster munitions, provide us with important military capabilities when confronting an enemy that outmatches us in terms of manpower and numbers of armored vehicles. That these provide assault breaking capabilities. So we keep them in strategic war reserve in case we need to use them. But it just seems to me that the United States has once again exposed, and indeed all of NATO have exposed the hypocrisy of their overall posturing. And it's all posturing. To sit there and condemn Russia for the use of cluster munitions, as we did early on in this conflict, only to turn around and suddenly say, well, no, it's okay to use cluster munitions, but only if they're used to kill Russians. It's hypocritical in the extreme. I think that, and it's also exposed the weakness of the moral stance taken by European nations who signed the Oslo Accords, who said that they oppose this, and suddenly they're unable to step up and represent what they claim to stand for. They've caved in to the United States, which means they were never serious. This was always about posturing, and that's the harsh reality. But again, this is going to come down to battlefield realities, and the awful truth is that the battlefield will continue to be a place where Ukrainian soldiers die at a rate of 10 to 1 over their Russian counterparts.
Biden begründete ja, den USA gehe die Artilleriemunition aus. Was heißt das für die Kriegsfähigkeit der US-Armee? Sollte diese Information überhaupt an die Öffentlichkeit gelangen?
The President of the United States is the ultimate authority when it comes to classification of U.S. information. And he has the sole ability, unmatched ability to release information to the American public as he sees fit. So who am I to question the commander-in-chief when he's decided to make this statement public? I actually am somebody who believes that sunlight is the best disinfectant. That if there's a problem, maybe it's best that we talk about it as opposed to hide it. So as much as I oppose much of what Joe Biden does, on this one, I found his willingness to speak truth refreshing because it says a lot of things. One, remember General Cavoli, the commander of Allied forces in Europe and the commander of all American forces in Europe, in a forum in Sweden in January, acknowledged that NATO had not imagined the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine today. And what that means, when you say you haven't imagined it, it means you're not prepared for it. Because what is a defense budget? I mean, a defense budget puts money aside to provide for the acquisition of material, the maintenance of material, the sustainment of the force necessary to meet all plausible military contingencies. And so if you're going to say that NATO exists to defend itself from Russian aggression, that's one of the reasons why NATO claims it exists. And the United States is a part of that. We need to have accumulated military capabilities necessary to fulfill that mission. But what we're seeing is that we haven't imagined the reality of war. So we have imagined collectively, NATO, the United States, Germany, and others have imagined a war where the expenditure of artillery ammunition is far less than the reality being confronted in Ukraine. Ukraine fires off more ammunition in 1 month than the United States produces in a year. That tells you that we haven't thought about this. So it's not just that by providing Ukraine with munitions, we are lowering our stockpile. Our stockpile was never sufficient to begin with. Our stockpile was never going to be able to stand up to the strains put on by a general war with Russia. What Joe Biden is acknowledging is not only that truth, but that we have further reduced this. The fact of the matter is the United States cannot fight and win a large-scale conventional war against a peer enemy or near-peer enemy that relies on artillery as a major factor in their military planning. That's Russia, by the way, but that's also North Korea. And I think that people need to understand that we being the United States, the South Koreans on the Korean Peninsula, would be immediately overmatched by North Korean artillery, that we have no response to that. North Koreans devastate us. We have insufficient artillery resources. This is what Joe Biden's saying. Now, the question now is how best to respond to this, because it's not just about producing artillery shells. People miss the point. I would challenge anybody. I could put 1 million artillery shells on the ground and you'd say, wow, that's a lot. And I'd say, okay, now deliver it against the enemy. So, well, I need artillery guns. Bingo. You need artillery guns. And how many do you have? Not enough. Remember, Ukraine is outmatched 10-1 by Russia. And Ukraine is an artillery-intensive force. Look at your average NATO table of organization and equipment and look at how many artillery pieces they have. To give you an example, a U.S. Army heavy brigade has 1 battalion of self-propelled artillery. That's 18 artillery pieces. 1 battalion, 18. That's not sufficient to the task. They would need, a Russian equivalent confronting them would have 100 to 200 artillery pieces. So it's there's bigger problems than just ammunition. It's an issue of imagination. NATO is going to have to reimagine its military and then be called upon to restructure. And that means that you're going to have to manufacture assets that you haven't planned to do. On ammunition, Germany and the European Union have come out and acknowledged that in addition to lacking the industrial capacity to produce ammunition, they lack the resources, meaning that even if they had an assembly line ready to produce, which they don't have the resources, the raw materials necessary to produce these. And this is a problem that the United States runs into as well. I'm glad Joe Biden said this because I think it's important that the American people understand that we have politicians posturing aggressively for the potential of expanded conflict in Europe, the potential of a conflict in China in the Pacific. And the reality is we can't win such a fight, that we are preordained to lose simply because we lack the capacity to sustain warfare on the scope and scale that's occurring in Ukraine, that is anticipated to occur in Taiwan. So I think it's very good that Joe Biden said what he said. I just hope the American people are listening and comprehending the truth behind his words.
Als du über den Einsatz von Streumunition gesprochen hast, Scott, hast du auch die Auswirkungen für die zivile Bevölkerung angesprochen. Jake Sullivan, der nationale Sicherheitsberater der USA, der erklärte, die Ukraine habe schriftlich zugesichert, dass sie die von den USA bereitgestellten Waffen so einsetzen würde, dass die Zivilbevölkerung möglichst wenig Schaden nimmt. Kann man der Ukraine wirklich vertrauen, dass sie die Waffen nicht gegen Zivilisten, zum Beispiel in Donetsk, einsetzt?
Ukraine provided similar assurances about the HIMARS system, and yet they've used the HIMARS system against civilian populations in Donetsk, Lugansk, and elsewhere. Ukraine provided similar assurances about the provision of U.S. Military equipment like Humvees, MRAPs, and others, and yet we found that the U.S. equipment was used to equip Ukrainian forces that penetrated Russian soil in the vicinity of Belgorod. So destroyed American-made Humvee vehicles, MRAP vehicles on Russian soil proves the lie of Ukraine's assurances. So Ukraine cannot be trusted. Ukraine is a nation that's increasingly becoming more and more desperate. And I think we're sadly going to see that Ukraine will use these cluster munitions against civilian targets in the Donbass.
Vielen Dank, Scott, für die aufschlussreichen Erklärungen.
Well, thank you.
Danke. Bis nächste Woche.
Okay. Have a good day.
Liebe Zuschauer, vielen Dank fürs Zusehen. Wenn euch die Sendung gefallen hat, teilt sie bitte breit in den sozialen Medien. Abonniert eben noch unseren Kanal Gegenpol. Wir haben neben Scott Ritter viele weitere spannende Berichte und Analysen. Bis dahin, bis nächste Woche. Tschüss.